Where's my Zoom? Here. I'm trying something new. Is this working or it's?
It is working, yes.
All right, cool.
But then last time it became clear that I cannot make the distinction between a presenter mode and a presentation mode. So.
Still after a year, I'm still not an expert on Zoom. It's always messy, a wrong screen or wrong.
So yeah, so I already shared the bio with everyone. So Hervé Lombaert is a professor at ETS Montreal. He's holding the Canada Research Chair in Shape Analysis and Medical Image Analysis. So I'm not going to read it completely, but Hervé did his PhD in McGill, and during his internship, I think at Siemens, he had some work with Leo Grady and had pretty good contributions in segmentation and graphs. Later on, he, after his PhD, he went to Inria together with Microsoft Research. He did a postdoc there. He did really, really interesting work on graphs on surfaces, especially brain surfaces. He worked quite a bit with graph Laplacians and their eigenvalues. Now, after his postdoc, he basically took the position at ETS Montreal as a professor, and then he got the research chair there. And it's I know Hervé quite well, and I really like his work, and it's a pleasure to have you here, Hervé, and present it to us.
Thanks again, Andrew, for having me. It's always nice to share your work as well. So I'll try to be skip a few slides, or so then I just remain on time. And please just stop anytime you want. And then, like if it takes too much time, I'll just speed up or adapt to your time. And before I start, though, it's today is June 24th. So here in Canada, or in Quebec in particular, it's a holiday. It's the Quebec National Day. So today will be, or was supposed to be, all fireworks and all having fun in parks and all, but I think nowadays it will all be illegal fireworks. But that's just wanted to say it's, I mean, we still live in the real world, and it's still a fun world to live. This one I can maybe skip. Hold on, how do I skip this? Although you may wonder who is this guy, basically. As Andrew was mentioning, I started a while ago in Siemens Corporate Research. That was and still is a research center, heavy center in on medical imaging. That was the kind of work I was doing, segmentations on cardiac surfaces. So that's something I'm kind of proud of. It's every hospital I go, I like to pinpoint, find the machine that has some of my code installed. So it's something I'm still proud of to today. And I always find this machine, so that makes me happy. And that was work on, if you are familiar with work on graph cuts, basically, that's the kind of work we were doing that was possible to do segmentation in one single click. Nowadays we do 0 click, with all learning. So it took 20 years to do from 1 click to 0 click. Quickly, then I started the other way around. I started first in a research center, and then I did the studies after. So I like to do things the other way around. So it's same thing, a bit segmentations, 4D images, fiber images. So it's like 6D, 6-dimension type of images. That was super fun. Postdoc at McGill, Inria and Microsoft Research, as well as exactly what Andrew was mentioning. So I think we almost shared the same office in when Andrew was in Cambridge, but yeah, we skipped I think a year off or something. And since then I'm in Montreal. So if you follow the geographical mobility, that's going from from New Jersey, New York, cool place, to the French Riviera, super cool place, to Montreal. So the weather is definitely better on the French Riviera. So that's just a quick slide to tell you like who am I, basically what I do. Cortical matching, I forgot to mention this type of things. I'll mention a bit in the talk. And who am I in terms of research? I like to describe myself as a shape or as a geometric guy. I see for me, machine learning is a very, very geometrical thing. I like to see deep learning or just learning in general. Statistics to me is very, very geometrical. So it's maybe just me weird, but it's to me it's very, I see landscape, I see points, I see a lot of points using this structure. So it's very geometrical to me. And that explains a lot of things. So I wanted to describe a bit or talk about graph convolutions. It's one of the work we did a couple of years ago, but it's not necessarily from a typical graph convolution or spectral approaches, but I wanted to give it a geometrical aspect to it. So it's maybe something different from other talks we can hear. So it's how to present and present this work in terms of a geometrical aspect. So from those types of shapes, yeah, for example, if you want to do finding correspondences between shapes on humanoid shapes, why not? But the brain to me is a much more interesting and challenging geometric. It's all convoluted, it's all challenging to do. So you can develop super cool algorithms. That's a great opportunity for that. Yeah, and then as you guys probably know, from the brain surface, you can do a lot of yeah, typical thing would be a segmentation, parcellations, finding the different parcels in the brain. Which is yeah, kind of a classification problem. You can do a regression, all kinds of things. And first, yeah, so those ideas, yeah, so if you want to do a learning, yeah, images, 2Ds, multimodal. So that was another work in the London's groups where from this, you want to find a segmentation mask, for example. So that was an older work. So that's still fine. It's on images. It's well defined. It's I mean there was a lot of algorithm back then, so it was more or less straightforward. Not straightforward, but it was obvious to work on grids. The whole question is basically how to move from the images to the segmentation masks on grids. That was all right. Then on the medical imaging field, there's a few challenges. The challenges is images are typically big, so you find different ways to go around the technical engineering challenges, but it's more or less always the same idea. You go through, you have a convolution and go through the images, then learn the different convolution filters and so on. To learn those filters, again, because the images are pretty big or data sets or whatever, it's you find different, not hacks, but different engineering tricks. So in that work in particular, if you work in a higher, lower resolution, you can do a UNet, all types of fancy tricks, but it's more or less the same ideas. You go pass through a convolution against an image. That's fine. Well, that's a cool image that Ben provided me to show. It's actually cool. No? It's, you have a brain, you see inside, you can all around. It's actually important not to do fancy, good images. No, that makes your work sexy. It's not my work; it's bad work, but it's yeah, it's part of the work as well. Why I was mentioning all this, I forgot. Oh yeah, so images, all good, all great. However, there's one issue. If you want to move on surfaces, so that works great on images, but if you want to move on surfaces, there's a few challenges. One of the main challenge, in particular, on the brain. Yeah, for example, here you have grids, points are space is very well defined. Neighborhood is very well defined. X, Y, Z's point coordinates. You know where's your left, top, down, right, and so on. You just do a +1 on an index. However, on the brain, how do you define this neighborhood? How do you define up and down? Especially if you have like a folding, which is very, very crooked, very, very folded. Those easy concepts on an image are actually not that trivial on the surface. So this creates a whole problem, not necessarily on terms of navigation, but in terms of distances, metrics, and so on as well. One question as well is, why should we learn on surfaces first of all? It all works great on images. Why not converting things on images and work on images? We have good tools for this. Sometimes you have data that actually lives on surfaces, not necessarily on images. So for example, parcellation is definitely something that is on the surface itself. So it's not an image problem, it's a surface problem. So you need, so having surface algorithm is actually convenient. You have particular types of data that actually fires up signal on a surface. That's the case of functional imaging. So having an algorithm working on surfaces actually could be convenient, or not could, but is convenient for that types of work. Why is it a problem on using image algorithm? Imagine, for example, you take those surfaces from the brain. You have different concepts. If you have 2 points on a surface, sorry, no, 2 points on a grid, so they can be neighbors. In fact, even neighboring voxels so those 2 points here can be 2 neighboring voxels. However, if you look closely, they are definitely not neighbors in space or on the surface. You need to actually travel quite a lot of distance. So that means the distance between those 2 points is definitely not 1 voxel or 1 unit in terms of imaging Manhattan distance, let's say. So that creates a whole ambiguity in terms of learning. So if you want to learn, and if the metric is completely crooked because of this ambiguity between imaging and the imaging space and the surface space, all your algorithm, I can guarantee that it will work weirdly. So that creates all sorts of problems here. Yeah, exactly. So this distance versus the Euclidean versus the surface distance is the geodesic distance is creates all those types of ambiguities. So how to learn on surfaces? From grids where it's all defined, you have let's say here a small convolution, different filters. That's what you would want to learn in an image space. And then you convolute these filters on an image, and then you have your fancy learning approaches. But on a surface, first of all, you don't necessarily have a nice grid like this. How do you define the neighborhood? How do you define those kernels in something which is not a lattice anymore? So it's that creates all sorts of problems here. So that's the challenge you want to do in curved spaces here. But once you have found a way to navigate on the surfaces, then it's the same idea more or less. You navigate those convolution kernels, and then you find your convolution responses, learn, do the features that way. So one idea to have a way to navigate on surfaces, if you have points on a surface, instead of so one way to navigate is to use coordinates. One naive way, or what you could have available to you, is the XYZ point that you have on points, but on surfaces. But as you've seen, if you just increment indices XYZ in XYZ spaces, you don't necessarily navigate on the surface. So the idea is to move from this Euclidean world, Cartesian coordinates, towards a coordinate system that actually lives on the surface. So that means instead of using XYZ, which is a very arbitrary choice, in fact, it can be, it's completely unrelated to your shape here. Moving to this Cartesian Euclidean extrinsic coordinate system, very arbitrarily, it has nothing to do with the shape. Moving towards something that is actually the coordinate system or the coordinate axis actually live on the surface. So that's the whole idea here. Different approaches. So I'll show one way, but there's multiple other ways. So that brings me back to work I did maybe 10, 15 years ago. It's a simple like problem. For example, my brain has a particular shape. I don't know, Ertung's or Ender's brain has a different shape, but you still want to find a correspondence point. For example, one point on my brain, where would be the equivalent point on somebody else's brain? And you want to do this for all the points you have. So may sound like an easy problem, but it's actually an active field of research. So one typical way is to maybe morph those surfaces all together. So that's fine. That's fancy mathematics, fun and all, but it's very slow. Works on small meshes. Free surfer simplifies a bit the problem and inflating all to a sphere. So it tries to minimize all the metric distortions and all, but that creates also different types of problems. It's an easy simplification to a sphere. And still, it takes a few hours, maybe a little bit faster today, but it's still very slow compared to different approaches, including those spectral approaches here. So from a few hours, those spectral approaches, I'll talk about this right now, takes roughly a few seconds. So that's convenient. And then you can work on very large meshes like 300,000 nodes. yeah, so some backgrounds, and that's useful, and that's how I wanted to present the geometric deep learning in terms of from a geometric perspective, geometric or shape perspective. The whole idea starts from, you've probably seen this experiment where you have a vibrating shape, you pour sand on it, and then depending on the different frequencies, harmonic frequencies, this sand will start to form a certain pattern. And this pattern is actually completely driven by the geometry or the shape of your vibrating plate here. If you have a shape of a violin, if you have a square or a circle, those patterns will have different shapes. These actually are used to find the purity, like for these, I forgot the name in English, but the ones that building the luthier, the ones building the violins and all, they actually use that kind of techniques. So it's called the cladding pattern. So it's fun links with music. It's so these patterns here are completely driven by the shape, different harmonics, different shapes that you have here. And these, again, is completely driven by your shape here. If you deform a little bit the shape of the violin or the guitar here, these patterns that you would see on the shape would start to follow a bit the shape that you have here. So it's a very strong property that is useful to find correspondences. And one of, for example, any shape can vibrate, including, for example, why not here meshes of a horse. What is interesting and why I wanted to show this is if you look closely, the XYZ points actually of both meshes here called galloping horse changes a lot. For example, the point here or in a humanoid, the point on the top of the finger, no matter how I move in space, the XYZ would move a lot, but the vibrating properties or the let's say the sand coordinate or the vibrating properties here, the color coded, we always stay the same here. For example, the front left leg, first harmonic would be green, second harmonic would be blue, and so on. And no matter how this leg here move in space, well, then all the harmonics here will stay more or less stable here. So that's actually very useful to find a correspondence. So instead of finding XYZ's correspondences in the XYZ world, where you face the problem of XYZ's moving all around, well, then if you work using those spectral or shape coordinates or shape characteristics, these are very stable no matter how they move in space. So that's the whole idea here of building a shape coordinate or spectral coordinate. So that's how I called it, to find correspondences and moving on to a few slides later. But I'll use these strong properties to find to build a learning framework on top of it. So the whole idea, this slide is actually important. It's moving from the concept of XYZ points, XYZs can move a lot in space, to a new world where coordinates are built extrinsically, completely depending and completely driven by the shape itself. So no matter how in this galloping horse, no matter how your leg is moving in space, it will always have the same shape coordinate, spectral coordinate. And these spectral coordinates are derived from these vibration characteristics. Talking a little bit more mathsy. So yeah, if you want to find correspondences in the Euclidean world, Cartesian coordinates, we see it's all facing all those types of problems. So in the spectral graph theory domain or field, what you would do is you would take a triangulation. You have you end up with a mesh. You have neighboring points, triangles. So that's how you can find neighbors, basically node I, node J in a graph or in a mesh, triangulated mesh and model. So that I'm simplifying this a bit, but you can report this this distance between node I and node J in a matrix, row, column, ij. There's a distance in between, and then you report this in a row, column, ij in a matrix. I'm simplifying a little bit because you need to normalize, you need to do you can use a Gaussian filter, all those kind of things, but it's more or less the same idea. You want to report in a matrix the affinity between 2 points, node I, node J, neighbors. You want to report this affinity in a graph, in a matrix that is, we call this the graph Laplacian matrix. And the fun part, if you simply decompose this matrix here, so it's a huge matrix, but luckily it's mostly filled up with zeros. Most of the points are not necessarily neighbors to each other. So if you decompose the spectral matrix, that means finding the eigenvectors and the eigenvalues. So it's one line in MATLAB or in Python or whatever. That's what you end up here. So this is one eigenvector. An eigenvector is one column of this eigenvector matrix. One column would have n, if n is the number of vectors, number of points. An eigenvector has n dimension and number of points here. So that means if you color codes every point with the value of the eigenvector element, that's what you would have here. And if you go in the spectral theory, that's related as well to the different things. In fact, it's super fun. So it's related to the vibration characteristics at different harmonics. So here you have the brain. It's not a galloping horse anymore, but it's a brain that would vibrate, for example, from left to the front to the back of your brain. So that's how it would vibrate this way. Second harmonic would be, let's say, a second axis of symmetry. So bottom and top would start to vibrate. And then you have different fancy, more complex shapes that start to vibrate. The more in higher frequency you go, the more finer detail starts to vibrate. A bit like a chord in a guitar. The lowest harmonic is like the simplest vibration, one pole, one movement. Second harmonic would have two poles. Third harmonic would have three undulation, so the higher frequencies you go, the more complex pattern you have on this chord or on this mesh or on the galloping horse here. And the eigenvalues gives you the frequencies more or less of this spectral coding, of this vibration. So that's how you get these. If you look closely, this first eigenvectors here gives you more or less this shape coordinates that I was mentioning earlier. So that's very convenient. Another way to visualize this, and that helped me a lot to understand those ideas. Instead of plotting in MATLAB, Python, if you plot the meshes, instead of plotting these meshes using XYZ coordinate, what if you plot those meshes using these first three spectral or shape coordinates? So instead of having these brains that we're familiar with, if you plot them using these spectral coordinates, that means every point is not displayed with XYZs, but with U1, U2, and U3. That's the meshes you find in the end. So from those two very different brains, if you look closely, the sulcus or the folds doesn't necessarily align correctly. But in a spectral world, spectral domain here, spectral space, those are actually very nicely overlapping. So it's very easy to find correspondences in this world rather than this complex Euclidean world. So from this Euclidean to spectral space, that really unlocked me a lot of, I understood a lot how to use those algorithms later on. And that I find in the graph convolution literature, you don't necessarily find this move or this explanation of this algorithm. So because it's much more easier to define any types of things. For example, in this slide, I'm describing how to find correspondences in this work. But you can apply learning that I'll come up. I'm seeing time. I think I'll move a little bit more. So then, yeah, so that's, you can apply any types of data as well, but you can fall back on the typical energies, functional that you want to optimize and so on. That's not necessarily what I wanted to show. Oh yeah, so that's how you would find closest point between them. If you want more details, there's a bunch of work by, not necessarily by only me, but there's a bunch of other people doing a lot of work. Ender also did some work in the past by using this signature on images as well. So that's why not, you can do this. But the whole thing is like from current method doing correspondences, you can do things in a few seconds, which is nice to have. Yeah, this is just a slide to show numbers. It's more or less the same with 84, 85, 83 is not necessarily what really interests me. It's mostly, to me, it's all the same thing. It's not the goal is a single percent more is not necessarily a better thing to me, but it's really the time that you have here. Yeah. So what does it have to do with learning? So if you remember from the graph, from the convolution kernels that you had, define on images, it's all fine. But if you want to do on meshes, you need to have this kind of representation, space shape coordinates. And now that I've just shown, I've made a small detour with this spectral correspondences or spectral coordinates. Now you start to understand a little bit more how to apply those convolution kernels on surfaces. Because now we have a way to navigate. You have a way to have a coordinates that actually lives on the surface. So why not? So maybe this I'll skip quickly. But in the past as well, before all the deep learning for the year, we did a few. We try to have those simple ideas on random forest. Why not? It works actually quite well. So that I'll skip quickly, but it was a slide to explain a little bit how this could be applied on decision trees. But the idea is more or less the same thing. It's how to represent space instead of using XYZs. If you apply the algorithm as is, using your for example, vector that includes the XYZ coordinates, that's what you will end up. If you want to segment, let's say it's called the calcula, it's called basically the vision area of the brain. Red is what you should get. Black is what you would get. Why you would get something that is completely wrong like this? I mentioned earlier, the notion of distance is very, very different. Distances on the surface versus distances on the volume, it's all ambiguous. So that's why you end up with very disconnected areas like this. Simple change, very simple change where you, from the XYZs, you now move, very simple replacement here. But it may sound simple, but fundamentally what's happening is now you're forcing the learning to be on the surface. So this whole concept with this very simple change here, that's what you end up doing. So here's an example on decision trees, but the same ideas are applied on convolution kernels as well. So it's very simple change here, but fundamentally something completely different is happening. The learning now happening directly on the surface. That's why like we can say it's a geometry aware now compared to an image. Yeah, so that's before and before if you do on XYZ coordinates. And after, so that's there again, same replacing XYZ with the spectral coordinates. That's on spectral forests. So now geometric deep learning that started to be to see more and more papers a couple of years ago as well. So those I took slides. I didn't know how familiar you were with geometric deep learning, and those are slides I took from a tutorial we gave a few months ago. But I'll do it quickly. So basically from an image, yeah, so on an image, you simply, it's a convolution that you do. So now here, see, if you're basically you have weights, input layers, and so on. That I'll skip because it's more or less obvious. Yeah, so that's problem with this is how do you do translation, and the tutorial that we wanted to do is we wanted to motivate why there's convolutions. So that I'll consider you know why convolutions is useful on an image. But on an image, it's more or less the same thing. So you can see this convolution kernel as a multiplication here. The whole idea is basically to find the weights of these convolutions. What is interesting to show is on a surface or in any space, basically, if you remember your signal processing classes, a convolution in our world is a multiplication in the Fourier space. And the spectral coordinates that I've just mentioned earlier, those are actually linked as well to a vibration or a Fourier space as well. So this a few works dating from quite a while back as well, but they saw this link. So most of the geometric deep learning papers that you would see more an explanation from this description here from a Fourier or this more on a Matzi space, Matzi approach here. So from this multiplication, you do the inverse, and then you fall back on the convolution. That could be written in terms of matrix notations. So a lot of simplification, in fact, in the initial works, and it's still in the latest works as well. In this first work, a convolution is done simply by using this multiplication here. This is fine. However, yeah, so this from this convolution to this simple multiplication here. So from what you have on an image, that's what you would have on a graph here. And the graph is defined by the adjacency matrix here. There's a degree matrix. It's more or less the same thing I was mentioning earlier. The matrix that reports the neighborhood status on graphs here. So that's how you will end up. Input layers that is now in the form of nodes, so it's still a vector. You multiply this with this matrix that is actually including the neighborhood structure of your graph. Activation layer, and then that's what you end up with your output layer. You can still cascade this into multiple layers, why not? But still, if you look closely, there's only one single parameter here. So all this fancy approach with all those simplifications to make it work nicely, you end up with one single parameter, one number, one scalar theta. So why not? But if you want to do fancy or fun kernels, it's a bit limited. So then, this work, that's, I think the geometric deep learning trend started a lot with this work here, but they said, why not? So, okay, let's, instead of using only one theta, let's do multiple thetas like this. They're still more or less the same idea to me. And if you want to do richer kernels or better kernels, you need a little bit more than this. And still, it's still defined or constrained to a single graph here. You cannot apply this on data where graphs are actually changing. For example, brains could have different triangulations, different shapes, different triangulations. So this cannot be applied as is on brains. A different work from Switzerland, in fact, as well. If I'm not mistaken.
So, Harry, may I cut? Like, I don't understand why you can't apply it to meshes on brains.
It's so basically the number of nodes is fixed just for the matrices to be able to work together. What else? The graph structure, if I remember, if you look at this, it's always the same one that has to be shared. But that was work from 2011. This one. So this work is from 2016, but still same constraint here. That's a figure I took from their paper. And there you can clearly see it's always the same graph structure and so on. So
it must be different data on the same graph.
So that works nicely, yes. So that works nicely on, so that was not made for computer graphics or medical imaging. That was made for social graphs, for example. For example, let's say the Facebook graph is always stable. I mean, or they can afford to compute everything, but it was good for that kind of things, or paper citation graphs or those type of things.
Thank you.
If you want to work on meshes, that starts to be a bit tricky. So then this work from the Bronstein group. So the idea was to okay, that's fine. Let's do a tangent plane on a surface. Let's say I have a, how do you call it, the diploma hat. And then on this diploma hat, you can define a coordinate system. Could be a polar system, rho and theta, and then you can define points on this polar coordinate system. And then you can learn small kernels on this polar coordinate system. Then you build somehow a framework where what you would actually want to learn is those kernels on these polar segments. Why not? So that works nicely on these surfaces. But the idea is how to parameterize kernels is so then the same group actually started to define the unifying framework where they moved so they could actually write this in a more formal way. Different, so you'd still learn weights on these polar segments. So different ways. So you either learn the different Gaussians that you have, different mu's, different sigma, different covariance matrices, different ways of defining these covariance matrices, these Gaussians. And that's the latest work here. But what you would learn here is these parameters of these Gaussians on a polar plane on the diploma hat. Good, great. So that you can define richer, more fancy fund kernels, but still in this one here, however, an orientation. What is north on the polar coordinate on the diploma hat? How do you orient the diploma hat? How do you deconstruct as well this the tangents plane? It's plane on this mesh. Why not? But imagine this on a brain surface. That will be a nightmare. So the way they did is so that's the part I feel there's improvement maybe on this approach or this type of work. So the way they found is by using different lines, building triangles one by one for every single patch, every single diploma hat they have. So that's costly. The north or the reference, the 0 degree, 0 theta is defined as the maximal angle of curvature. So that's I don't know, is this arbitrary or not? But that's debatable. But what we have now is, if you remember half an hour-ish ago, we have something cool. We have a way to define parameters, coordinates on the brain surface instead of using patchy polar coordinates. And again, this same thing. And this ambiguity comes from the voxel versus surface space. But on a brain surface, if you want to move these ideas on these surfaces, well, yeah, you'll navigate this tangent plane here, or the tangent plane can be upside down depending on where the folding is on the brain surface. So it's really becoming a nightmare to play with. And what I just showed in the first half hours, how to move from coordinate systems to a polar or XYZ coordinate to something that is completely living on a mesh here. And this vibration or spectral coordinates I was mentioning, it has, I mean, you can change the triangulation here. It's not necessarily a problem. The shape would vibrate the same way. So of course, I mean, points can end up with different numbers of points in a mesh, different positions of the points in the mesh as well. But that's okay. I mean, if the points are not necessarily falling back on a triangle edge, triangle corners, you can still rely on interpolations to fall in between triangles. Why not? But basically, what I wanted to show is the vibration characteristics. No matter how you triangulate your mesh, I mean, that will still vibrate the same way.
Can I ask a question?
Of course, yeah.
So this notion of vibration, does this refer to variability across population, across a number of
Oh, it's not across the population, it's across the one single shape. For example, a humanoid, like a mesh of a person or a brain, those shapes will more or less describe the axis of symmetry as well. So if you take the axis of symmetry of a humanoid, we have a left and a right, which is very, very predominant. So your first axis of symmetry, you'll see, usually you have the two left and right portion that will start to vibrate. And if you go beyond, the second most prominent axis of symmetry will be the top and the bottom. You still have like two limbs on two legs, two arms. That would be your second kind of axis of symmetry. Third one would be your two arms. Fourth one would be your two legs, and so on. So it's really per subject, per shape, not in population wise.
Okay. Is it possible to give some intuition for the brain? Like if you have the
brain, same thing. It's just, like I see the brain as any type of shape. So it's if you have a brain, it's mostly elongated like along our skull. So the main axis of symmetry would be something that is cut in half. So the two hemispheres would vibrate. If you take only one hemisphere, it would vibrate along the main elongation axis. So it would vibrate this way. Second axis, the second most prominent axis of symmetry would be like the top. Trying to do with zooms. Would be this one, and then we'd start to have more complex patterns like this. So if you have like a sulcus or folds that find somehow, and the brain has a lot of symmetry like this. So for example, the central sulcus, it's called. It's a major geometrical aspect of the brain. That would be your cut axis of symmetry. So it's a very spectral, the spectral decomposition will actually give you a very, very nice way to pinpoint the central sulcus. So it's not only a very functional anatomical aspect, it's also a very geometrical, symmetrical aspect. And again, it's per shape, per mesh, and not in a population. And then you can do fancy statistics. You can figure out how that varies in the population, and you'll see it doesn't necessarily vary a lot in the population. It's for example, the central sulcus will always be the zero line in the population, which is fun. Which is fun to segment, for example, do the parcellation, which I'm losing time. Convolution. Pooling as well, so it's all those things you have on an image, defining convolutions and pooling. It's still defined on the mesh. And I wanted to show, so there's two words, but I only show one on how to do graph convolutions. If you're more curious, there's one on graph pooling as well, so why not? Convolution is it's a work of a student in our group doing this. I'm only showing what he did. Moving from convolutions on surfaces, using exactly what I just showed. That's why I wanted to take some time on the spectral coordinates earlier, because it's a major key element to understand these approaches. And then you can navigate kernels here on the brain surface. That's you've seen. That's how you get. So this slide again, it was a part of a tutorial. So I go slow in a tutorial just to make sure that people understand on the same pace. But this slide you've shown, you build a graph, you take the triangulation, neighborhood points, node I, node J, you report the affinity, the distance, for example, between those 2 points, a row, column, IJ in the matrix. You decompose this matrix one line, you end up with these vibration characteristics. I think Nirav was asking, that's again, the main axis of symmetry, top, bottom, front, back, and then more complex symmetry. So that's the 15th eigenmode. You see more fancy axis of symmetry. Oh yeah, there's an ambiguity to rotation, which is a bit bothering, but it's we like challenges. So we, instead of bothering with this ambiguity, because axis of symmetry, if you look closely, eigenvectors is, if you think closely, those are living on a hypersphere. So it's ambiguous to rotation. These axes of symmetry can basically rotate in any ways. So what you would need to is you would need to learn or to basically transform your space into a reference space where everybody has the same everybody talks the same language basically. Yeah, so that's on how you would do on an image. Your input layer, you would navigate on your input layer using simple increments in your indices. So that's very easy on an image. That's your weight you want to learn. That's on an image again. And on a graph surface, that's what Kartik was mentioning. So he takes the same idea, but instead of incrementing indices on the XYZ coordinates, he does this using UI and UJ. And those are the spectral coordinates. So it's exactly the same concept. Simply now you use spectral coordinates. So it's exactly the same thing. So then you can increment these spectral coordinates. There's a phi here for, there should be a phi somewhere here as well, but it's to do a kernel, a Gaussian kernel. So this is typically a Gaussian kernel where you would learn here, that's the parameters. You would learn the mu's and the sigmas, the center and the covariance matrices of these kernels. There you go. Here's this exponential here. But it's exactly the same concept. The main idea was to replace the XYZs or the increment in the indices into now using a spectral coordinates. So it's, again, very simple change. In terms of architecture, like the simplest, the better here. So if you just cascaded a few typical convolutions with a few activation typical ways. I mean, you can, different approaches, but it's one way to show the differences. And what changes here is now you work on spectral coordinates here. And as in the decision trees I was mentioning earlier, was more or less the same concept. You now directly learn on the surface here. That's why it's possible to have those kind of things. And again, it's not my direct work. It's mostly the work of a student in our group. Yeah. That's another way to visualize what's happening in the layers. You see the earlier layers is very coarse features. The more you go, the more towards the end you start to see the parcels in the brain. Yeah, but the whole idea is to work with spectral coordinates here. That's how you will get these navigations on the brain surface. Loss functions, not much surprises here. It's a simple cross entropy. What you would learn again is these central and covariance matrices of the graph kernels, but now they are defined in terms of spectral domains here. Validation. Validation, it's actually a cool data set that I like a lot. It's mind-boggling, it's free to use. It's I like open data sets because everybody can compare to and so on. So a few subjects, more or less 100, but they're kind of manually labeled parcels. So that's good to test algorithms. So here we wanted to learn how many layers, how many kernels to use. So Kartik experimented quite a bunch, and then found out that it's more or less the same thing, but there's a slight improvement. For the sake of parcellating a brain, there's this empirical approach, but using here 6 kernels and 4 layers is a good way. Another way to visualize them is to see the evolution through the epochs, to the training. So you see the more you evolve, as expected, you see more and more the parcels getting convergent. In terms of results, you find certain numbers of dice parcellations, dice metric of the dice scores of the parcellation, Hausdorff and so on. What you should compare really is using this approach, which uses spectral coordinates versus graph convolutions. You're using Euclidean or the typical ways you find in the literature, like the Monette or the graph convolutions I was mentioning earlier. If you apply this simply using polar or Euclidean coordinates, that's what you would get here. So in the problem of brains, you would get 50% more or less, which is very disturbing. Free surface 84, so 84, 86 is not necessarily what interest means. More or less the gap, the jump from this guy, Euclidean, to this guy, shape or spectral coordinate. That's a comparison, a visual comparison here. So yeah, forest is not necessarily interesting. Spectral element meter, but that's the graph convolution here in the Euclidean domain. So on the eye, when you plot this on the ground, on the computer screen, that looks fine. You see the parcels, you see some problems. That looks okay. But when you look at the numbers, really, it's terrible. 50% here. This is our case. We still have some issues in the borders here, but it's much better here. And then you can clean up a little bit more by regularizing a little bit more. So it doesn't change much the dice metrics. Neither the Hausdorff distance somehow, but it's so just visually it's more appealing here. But the simple change from here to here, and the simple difference here is it's using XYZ's coordinate here or polar coordinates, huh? Towards using XY spectral shape coordinates, the vibration characteristics. Yeah, then of course it's fast and so on. So that's it. So it's what I wanted to mention. It's a paper 2018, in fact. Yeah, conclusion is what I wanted to show. So I spent quite a lot of time on showing the spectral parameterization because that's the key element to understand then the graph convolutions from the way I like to see the problems here. But you can see this in terms of a Fourier space that helps you to develop all the mathematics behind. But I'm more a geometric guy than a Fourier guy. That's why I made this little detour that may possibly help you in understanding those approaches. There's a work that I didn't show, but instead of doing convolutions as well, you can use those ideas to do a pooling. How do you pool elements in an intelligent way on surfaces? So on graphs, sorry. So why not? And so take home message is maybe if you want to work on graphs or on meshes or on brains, maybe just have a look on the spectral shapes. Things are becoming much more simpler on there. And yeah, that's there's a major limitation to make this in bold. In fact, the meshes need to have the same topology. That means no holes. If it's topologically a sphere, genus 0, yeah, like a hemisphere, for example, a brain, that should be fine. But if you want to work on different types of shapes that is cut, truncated, then you should not choose those approaches. They will be messy. What else? Oh, that's something. That's something else. Cool. That's it.
Thank you very much.
I took almost the whole hour. So.
That was good. Are there any questions?
So I have one question. Thank you very much for the nice talk. So do I understand correctly, we always need the meshes before applying these convolutions. So first we would need to get the mesh of the brain, and then we can do the convolutions on top of it.
Yeah, so those approaches, all the geometric deep learning algorithms, they expect you to work on meshes or on graphs, and more in particular on graphs. And graphs can be extracted from a mesh, which is a surface, which is taken from a surface and so on. So it's not necessarily. I mean, nowadays you see more and more work on the simplification. For example, you can have on an image, you can have super voxels where they somehow glue cluster together mesh vertices, vertices, voxels for particular. So they group together, they cluster together so a certain voxel that starts to build up a certain graph. So this graph is not taken from a surface, but it's taken from an image where you have a hierarchical graph like this. So it's, I'm thinking there's, especially this year, I don't know why, at McGill, there's you see trends like this, like tons of work on transformers, graph transformer, things like that. So those could be used, you see more and more of those. So those are not taken necessarily from a mesh, but they may help you. You doing this detour from a geometrical perspective and can help you understand what's going on the graph here. So yeah, sorry. So those can be applied on graphs, and the graphs can be from a mesh, but from also an image via this super voxel ideas. But all what I showed here, for example, graph parcellation or brain surfacing, yeah, I do expect, I mean, this work expect you to use a mesh. So which is extracted from the surfer, from any types of, yeah.
No, thank you. That answered the question. I was just wondering how easy is it to get a mesh for an object that interested in it?
That is okay. That is, yeah, nowadays, from especially the brain, I mean, the white and the background is almost black, so it's very, like, finding the mesh is not necessarily a problem. Kartik, in fact, is even working on a yeah, cool work. Yeah, just as a teaser maybe. But as so from instead of working directly on the graph, he starts to bypass this step by working directly on the image itself. So from the image, the graph is in fact a byproduct. It's like a function you can learn from the image. So he makes this learning step here, but why not? But, why I said this, I forgot. Yeah, anyways.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Is this, so when you write the Laplacian and take the eigen modes of it, you say these are the modes of vibration and so on of the surface. So it sounds like it is some sort of a basis for the shape of the brain.
Exactly.
So could there be other bases which would be more suitable to do tasks that we want to do and so on? Is this the only, so like a very simple analogy would be like the Fourier basis for images, but there are actually different bases which are a lot better, like the wavelet basis for doing other stuff. Is this idea also applicable to graphs, or is it?
So those, in fact, are very related to the Fourier basis. But there are others, exactly as you mentioned. One of the popular ones would be using wavelet kernels, for example. Why not? Using those Fourier or those vibration or those graph Laplacian is actually nicely. It's those ideas actually has been evolving a lot in the computer graphic community. There's a simple reason. It's very linked to symmetry. It's very linked geometrically. It makes a lot of sense to use them. For example, the central sulcus I was mentioning earlier. It's always the zero. It's more or less the yellowish line here that you see. So it's very linked to the geometrical aspect, axis of symmetry. What else? It's linked to curvature. It's linked. That's yeah. I don't necessarily have a strong argument, but it's really convenient geometrically. But why not? You can use other bases. There's a work not so far away from where you are as well. There was a work from in Daniel Kremer's lab. They worked on what was that? It was something related to wavelets as well, but something a little bit different. They found a different approach. Why not? There's work on wavelet itself. Here in Montreal, there's another group who has explored this a bit, but has not tried this on brains. So that's what is fun working on brains is because you have different works here and there on spectral shapes. But working on the brain is you really see the challenge. Sometimes they don't necessarily work, or you need to tweak, or you need to find different ways. So the brain really pushes the limit of what you can do. Yeah, I don't know if it answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Maybe I can follow up. So in the experiments you've done for the parcellation, what is the input data on the graph?
The input of the graph?
Yes.
The input here would be how does that sound? This graph. So the graph is the input is so the output is more easy to explain. The output is simply the parcellation here. So so this is a vector. In fact, a vector of n being the number of points, and gives you the classification or gives you the parcel of what you have. This one I forgot. I think it was 30 or 80, 30-ish parcels. The input is so we want it to be more or less standard with what is done in brain neuroimaging. So the input is usually the Selkov depth. So that means for every point, so same thing. This guy here is a vector of n points, n point being the n being the number of points. Sorry, and every element, every dimension is, for example, this vertex is 1 is how deep is the vertex 1 in the surface. So this is directly the output of the surface. But this could be something else, depending on the data you want to learn. Could be the cortical thickness, could be the MRI intensity, something like that. This could be necessary, whatever you want. And then what you need is a way to parameterize your point. Is this point in the front? Is this point in the back? So to know this, instead of using this polar or this spectral Euclidean coordinate, you use those spectral coordinates. So on top of the Selkov depth or whatever data you want to learn, for every point here, so now this guy here is not a vector anymore, but it's a matrix of this guy's 4-dimensional matrix, four columns, where every point would have the value of this first spectral coordinate, second spectral coordinate, third cortical coordinate, sorry, spectral coordinate, third spectral coordinate, and Selkov depth. So that's your input here. So that means a point knows how deep it is and knows where it is on the surface here. And the output is the parcel for the points in question.
Okay.
And in the architecture or the layers, that's your input here. That's how you will build this. The convolution that you have here is built using these spectral coordinates, which is convenient. So what you would learn here is those two guys here. And then you iterate. K is the number of kernels you have. M is what? M appears here. That's the number of feature layers you have. What else?
So you don't learn the weights?
The weights are this guy here.
So you learn them as well?
Yes, yeah. So then it's a little bit of this kernel plus a little bit, yeah, so exactly. And what else? J is the neighborhood, so that's where you get J and K. This one is maybe more clear, more or less the same thing to what you would learn from this guy. This guy, and then in fact, this guy should be boxed green as well. So compared to the geometric deep learning approaches or work or body of literature you would find, you would not necessarily find these guys like this. So Kartik was inspired, and then he said, "Why not using these? It's everything gets simpler." That's his contribution, basically.
It's very nice.
Then I'm probably skipping a lot, and I'm sure Kartik struggled a lot to make it work. There's all the internal details that I'm not necessarily familiar with. He's the one who suffered tweaking all the things. From what I saw, he did not suffer too much. So, but that's I'm sure there's more detail than this. But it's his code is actually available. I want to have him clean up a little bit more the code, because now the code is a bit messy. There's a portion in MATLAB, there's a portion in Python. You need to juggle between those two codes. So it's not necessarily usable, but there's code available. So if you guys want to play, if you guys want to debug it as well, yeah. So I plan on spending the summer on having the code much more usable.
I think before he hears that, he ran away. He joined briefly. Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Any last questions for Hervé?
And by email as well. I mean, always. We can't travel, so I'm here on this chair the whole time.
Pandemic life. Thank you very much, Hervé. Thanks for the fantastic talk.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.